Hi, I'm William Henderson,
And I'm B. McGraw.
and this is episode 2 of the Unjerked podcast. So, like we mentioned last time, the purpose of this podcast is basically to look at a internet sort of echo chamber on Reddit or Twitter and kind of do some investigation, see what the real truth is behind everything. So, as we mentioned last time, we are semi-affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
all right. So our first episode is on the national debt. So let's get started. So, anyways, why are we talking about the national debt? And this is specifically about the U.S. national debt. Why does that matter?
Because we want our money to mean stuff, and if we just keep spending it, then we're gonna Weimar Republic ourselves into some nonsense, right? We're just a step away from that, aren't we?
So, what's some of the word on the street? Based off your academic Reddit research.
We should definitely use crypto for everything, or something based in anything. As soon as we go off of the gold standard, like how on earth is the government staying afloat? It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so we're all going to get crypto wallets and store pieces of paper
Yeah,
with
I mean, if
crypto
they're just
codes on them.
borrowing and spending money arbitrarily. Well, the two main circle jerks that I see online are, if I can balance my checkbook, why can't the government? If they're going to keep spending, then the dollar isn't going to mean anything pretty soon. And then the other side of that coin is, well, if they can spend as much money as they want, then why don't they pay for all of my health care? Why don't they pay for all of this and all of these social services? So it's like, is there a limit or is there no limit?
So those are very good points as far as kind of like starting points of discussion go. I think they're kind of flawed ways of looking at the situation. And what I mean by that, so when it comes to, why can't we pay for our health care, because the government's spending all their money on XYZ. The problem isn't not enough money being spent on healthcare. In fact, the government spends tons of money on healthcare, and that's what the problem is in the U.S. And that's not what our episode's about. But the U.S. spends a lot more money on healthcare than other countries, while having worse outcomes if you're looking specifically at other developed countries. So, it's a starting point as far as discussion goes, but we actually spend tons and tons of money on healthcare. The other thing, I can balance my checkbook. Why can't the government do the same? I mean, I suppose they could, but there are benefits to a limited form of debt. And so what I mean by that is, okay, so the U.S. federal government is running a deficit. A deficit is the annual accumulation of debt, and then the debt is kind of the total. So that's what the difference is between those two terms. But, why would you run a deficit at all? And I think the reason why is that there's different ways you can get money. You can, bring in taxes, you can print more money, you can borrow money, and there's pros and cons to each of them. And in fact, if you can get a very low interest rate on borrowing money, it could make sense in certain circumstances. So let's say, as far as personal life goes, let's say you get a mortgage at 1%, which is ridiculously low, but hypothetically speaking, if you could get a mortgage at 1%, would it make sense to take that and buy a house? Probably, yeah, because that's a very low rate of interest. A house is an asset you could sell later. You can rent it out if you move out. And if the interest rate's that low, you could probably, make money doing that. And so that's just an example as far as personal life goes. If we look at the country as a whole, so let's not look just at the government. Let's look at all the assets and liabilities of the federal government, state government, businesses, individuals, and look at the total balance sheet of the U.S. Would it make sense, again, hypothetically, to borrow money at 1% interest and use that to build a bridge that is then given to a state government? And let's say the bridge has tolls and the tolls bring in 2% a year. So I made all those numbers up. But the point is like, okay, in that case, you borrow money at a very low rate and then you use it to buy an asset that's cash flowing at a higher rate. Makes complete sense, right? So, okay, in some circumstances, borrowing money makes sense. But is there a limit? And the answer is, of course, there's a limit. So we've seen countries like Argentina, they constantly default and they have hyperinflation. Greece really struggled. I don't think they actually defaulted during the global financial crisis, but they were in a pretty bad place. So
what would you say is the line that you cross when you are spending too much?
well, there's different ways of looking at it. There's, debt as a percentage of GDP. There's deficit as a percentage of GDP, debt as a percentage of, total assets in the US. So it's really a relative figure compared to the capacity of your economy. Also, another thing to mention when it comes to Argentina and Greece, in the case of Greece, they owed most of their money in euros. They don't control the euro market, right? Because the euros are not, I don't think Greece prints its own euros. I believe that's controlled centrally by the European Union. And so they couldn't really inflate away their debt. And so they were put in a difficult position. In Argentina, a lot of their debt was denominated in dollars. And so when their own currency was struggling, they were in a position where they're like, oh crap, like we're struggling to pay off, this dollarized debt that's going up and up in value compared to our own currency. So, and then, when, the more and more levered you get, the higher the interest rates are. So interest rates are a huge part of it. So if you're borrowing at 1% interest, probably not a huge deal. If you're borrowing at 10% interest, that's a massive deal. And so recently, this is becoming more of a big deal because interest rates for like 10-year treasuries are at like 5% now or something like
I heard
that.
about that this morning.
And this is November of 2023. So yeah, it becomes more of an issue when interest rates are higher. It becomes more of an issue when, deficit or debt as a percentage of GDP gets higher. So that's kind of when it becomes a bad thing. And so at the end of the day, the US government technically could perpetually avoid default by just printing money forever, but that would lead to hyperinflation, obviously a bad thing. You can increase taxes, but at a certain point, that does become sort of a contractionary policy. If you raise taxes too much, that can cause the economy to contract. So it's a balancing act. You have to kind of manage different sources of financing and make things work.
So
but what if, like,
what
go
if
ahead.
one thing that I hear a lot is, so we're borrowing money. Who are we borrowing money from? And a lot of people be like, tons of foreign investors. We're borrowing a lot of money from China. What if China just stops lending us money, or whoever the foreign investors are?
Well, I think, people still lend money to Argentina, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just think that's not a super realistic scenario. And also, if the value of US bonds drops tremendously and China holds a lot of US bonds, well, that's not good for China either. So I think the idea of China just dumping all of their debt is probably not realistic. And that kind of ties into what role US debt plays in the economy. So treasuries are considered the safest asset in the market. And for people who say, well, that's not true, the US government is not a safe source of financing. What if we default on our debt? Like I said, the US could print money forever and never default, and that would be horrible for the economy. But then other assets would be hurt even more than treasuries would. So if the US entered an inflationary spiral, stocks would probably be hit pretty hard. So treasuries are considered the riskless asset in the economy, and everything is kind of judged based off of that. So a lot of, different organizations, pension funds, different agencies, etc., hold bonds as part of the safe part of their portfolio. When you do 60-40, portfolio in your retirement fund, those bonds, they're mostly, US treasuries. You also have corporate bonds, but those are considered riskier than US bonds. So that's kind of a top level view of like, okay, why does debt exist? What is the point of this debt? And there's a few other extra things that you can do with the debt. If you're entering a recession, if you've heard of Keynesian economics, so you can do counter-cyclical spending. So you can spend more than your capacity when there's a recession. Theoretically, when the economy's booming, you start cutting down on spending, which in real life doesn't really happen.
No, that's always the counterpoint to Keynesian is like, oh, well, good in theory, but no one ever does the other side of the coin.
And the most extreme example is like in World War II, debt skyrocketed because, we were producing all this machinery that we couldn't do unless we borrowed money. So imagine if someone in World War II was like, hey, I know we want to beat the Nazis, but, we can't borrow money. So we're going to have to just, not make any planes.
Go at it with your pocket knives.
Yeah, just go at it with your pocket knives. I feel like that probably wouldn't fly.
No, probably not.
So debt can be a good thing, but too much debt is obviously a bad thing. So I think a good thing to think about is like, okay, how much is the debt? What is the history of the debt? Why is the debt going up? So inputs and outputs, right? So what are the inputs when it comes to revenue? I mean, more or less it's taxes, right? U.S. government brings in taxes. And then what are the outputs? What do you spend money on? So there's a wide variety of programs. But if you look at like, okay, how did those change over time? So before World War II, and especially before the Great Depression, federal spending, federal taxes were minuscule. And, I think the reason why is, we didn't have entitlement programs and our military was tiny. So what really did the federal government do? It basically had federal laws and enforced those laws, had a small military. Other than that, not much else. And then after World War II, taxes do go up. They peak at close to 20% right at the very end of World War II. And this is data from the Federal Reserve. And kind of bounces around. It goes, drops all the way down to, and this is percent of GDP. So 20% of GDP in 1945 drops down to 13% in 1950, which is the lowest it's been. In terms of, it's never been lower since then. It was certainly lower than that before World War II. Pops back up to around 18% by 1952, kind of hops around. More or less. And then in the 1990s, it does go up to close to 20% again, drops a ton, down back to 15 in 2004, goes back up, drops a ton, down to 14 in 2010, and then it bounces back up in 2015, drops back down, bounces back up. So you guys just heard me say drops down and bounces back up a ton. And
I'm getting dizzy.
Yeah, I'm looking at a graph saying this, and in audio form, it doesn't really sound like anything.
And you said some percentages there. Is that debt to GDP ratio, or
no? This is percent of GDP. So taxes as percent of GDP. So GDP is
taxes.
Yeah. So GDP is how much stuff the U.S. makes per year, and so it's a good measurement of saying like, okay, how much, taxes, what percent of our productive capacity is basically given to the government in terms of taxes. One thing you do see is in boom times, it goes up. And then when there's recessions, tax revenue goes down. So that's a trend you see. You do see, I would say you could argue tax rates are probably on the lower end now than they used to be. If you're talking like I would say past 20 years is slightly below trend as far as tax rate goes. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing I do hear pretty often on that note is if we live in a democracy with people voting for their representatives who determine that rate of taxes, what incentive is there to vote for people who will raise taxes?
I don't think there really is one. And there's some research, I don't have a link to it, but there's some research talking about how many countries kind of have a stable tax, because there's different sources of taxes. There's income tax, payroll tax, etc. But when you add everything up, it tends to kind of hover in the same percentage. And so I think for most people, there's sort of an overall percentage that they feel comfortable with. The US is lower than, for example, in Western Europe, I would say.
Yep.
If you look over to the deficit, so when you look at, okay, how much deficit is there? So obviously there's a massive deficit during World War II, and then spikes up, and it's, I would say from 1950 until 1974, it mostly hovers around like minus 2% or so a year as percent of GDP. And then the deficit slowly goes up all the way to 1983. It's about negative 5.7% a year, hovers around there until the 90s. And then the deficit actually starts shrinking. By year 2000, there's a 2.3% surplus. So towards the end of the Clinton era, there's pretty substantial shrinking of the annual deficit, to the point that, towards the end of the 90s, the government was bringing in more money than it was spending. And then starting in 2001, deficit ballooned, and it's been bouncing around, but, in 2009, it was almost negative 10%. And then in 2020, it was negative 14%. Yeah. So anyways, that's kind of a history of the deficit. I honestly, when you look at the tax part, I don't see a huge trend, maybe slightly below trend as far as tax rates in the past 20 years, but it's not excessive. On the deficit side, you do see much more of a trend where the deficit year to year is increasing. So that's that. What do we actually, so there's two additional questions. So where does our tax money come from, and what do we spend our money on? So just, without any prior knowledge, what do you think is the percentages as far as like what we spend money on?
Ooh, okay. I haven't looked at it.
Okay.
All right, it's right there. My guess is primarily DoD and Social Security. I bet you that accounts for something crazy like 70% of the budget, and then everything else is just randomly sliced up. All right, I'll close the mic.
I feel like we've already talked about this. So
we probably have.
Yeah, so I feel like 70% might be slightly exaggerated, but, pretty much on point. So there's two types of spending. There's mandatory and discretionary. So mandatory spending is, there's laws that say you have to spend money on Social Security, Medicare, etc. So there's Social Security, 16% of the budget, Medicare, 16%, health, which probably includes Medicaid, and that's about 12%. Income security, which includes, retirement benefits, food stamps, housing assistance, etc., is about 9%. And then, on the discretionary side, you have DoD, which is 14%. Interest is at 10%. And I think right now the interest is actually higher than DoD because of higher borrowing costs.
Oh,
but as of,
really?
This data, which comes from the Treasury, DoD interest was at 10, general 5.9%, and then it starts to drop significantly. VA benefits 3.5%, education 3%, commerce and housing credit 1.7%, transportation 1.6%. I'm going to skip some of these. Interestingly, international affairs, which is international assistance, is 1%. General science, space, and technology is 0.5%. And so, some thoughts here. For people who say we don't spend enough money on healthcare, we spend a lot of money on healthcare. If you combine healthcare and Social Security, you're talking, or put it this way, if you combine healthcare with different forms of income security, you're talking basically half of the entire budget. And then DoD is next with 14%. So that in total is like 65% of the budget.
So we're
And then
spending more on interest than we are on the DoD right now.
I think right now we are, yeah.
Wow, that doesn't
Yeah.
seem efficient at all.
Yeah. So that's why the rising interest costs are making this more of an issue than it
Oh,
used to be.
right.
Yeah.
That
But
yeah, that might cause some big fights in Congress, I imagine, right now.
but I think what I want to say as far as all this goes is for people saying, the reason we have a huge deficit is because, of NASA. It's like, no, that's not why. Like, or, we're spending too much money on international aid. That's not what it is.
I mean, 0.5% isn't much, but that's still a lot to be photoshopping people on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, those sound stages of, the moon landscape, they're not cheap. So, yeah, I was being sarcastic in case anybody actually thought I believe those conspiracy theories. So
I did hear from a friend the other day that he's a fake moon landing person. He's like, "Did you see how much NASA spends on their like visual studio department or something?" I'm like, "No, but I imagine it's a lot because they put out a lot of pictures." I mean, half of what they do is take pictures in space these days.
yeah, I
Or,
guess,
like, the space-based NASA.
yeah, I think the point of all this is, okay, we have talk on Capitol Hill about the deficit and the debt and what we need to do to rein it in. But right off the bat, Social Security is untouchable, Medicare is untouchable, Medicaid is untouchable, DoD is untouchable, and can't raise taxes. So how do you fix the problem with all of those preconditions? The answer is the math says you can't. So the reality is you have to look at those areas in order to tackle the debt. So who owns our debt? It's 23% owned by foreigners. 40% of it is owned by various U.S. government agencies, the Federal Reserve, other agencies. And then the rest is a mix of, American investors, institutions, etc. And there's a good chance a lot of people have U.S. debt in their retirement accounts because a lot of retirement accounts have a mix of stocks and bonds, and a lot of those bonds are U.S. treasuries. So there's a good chance a lot of the debt, or a portion of the debt might be owned by yourself. Something to think about. So let's move over to the revenue side. So we already talked a little bit about taxes. Is there anything additional interesting as far as revenue goes? I would say the one big change you do see is the composition of where the government brings its money from. So in 1950, income tax was probably about 40%. Corporate income tax was probably about 25%. Payroll tax was about 10%. Excise tax was about 15%. And then there was other taxes. I hope that added up to less than 100%. If not, you know what? It is what it is. But how has that changed? And more importantly, what are the differences between all these taxes? So corporate income tax, I think, so there's individual income tax. That's pretty self-explanatory. Corporate income tax is basically tax on corporations. So whatever net income they have, or pre-tax net income, that's taxed. Payroll tax. So the difference between payroll and income tax is that payroll tax is taxed specifically on your W-2 income. So your main job, or maybe if you have a second job, if it's W-2 income, you get taxed on that. Whereas income tax includes, your total income. So that could be W-2, that could be dividends from your investments, short-term capital gain. So if you make a profit and sell stocks in less than a year's time, that's considered income. So there's more different categories that are considered income. Whereas payroll tax is just from your W-2. Payroll tax is mostly used to pay for Social Security and Medicare, I believe. And then excise tax. So the difference excise tax is like a sales tax, except the total price of the tax is included on the sticker price. So if you go to the store and do sales tax, that's almost certainly either a state tax or a city tax, and they tack it on at the end. So you'll buy something for $5 and they're like, oh, and tax is also an extra, whatever, 70 cents. Whereas an excise tax, they already include the price. So why would they do that? What's the difference? Do you have any thoughts, B?
Well, there's different incentives for different types of taxes. Like a sales tax is almost regressive because it doesn't affect the wealthy as much, while payroll taxes, especially taxing at higher rates, kind of makes more sense.
So that's all true, but I was talking specifically excise tax versus sales tax. So what's the difference of taxing something and then adding the tax at the end when you go to the register versus already including the tax in the sticker price?
Yeah,
it's actually a psychological trick.
That much of a thing. Yeah.
So the reason why is if you don't include the tax on the sticker price, people don't think about the tax when they make their purchase decision. They're just like, oh, it costs, how many people when they go grocery shopping, they're like, okay, I need to add a 9%, rate on those crackers I bought. Nobody thinks about that. You're just like, the tax is what it is and you pay it at the end. Whereas if you include the tax in the price, it increases people's perception of how much it costs, and they're less likely to buy the thing. And so excise taxes are used a lot on vice products, so on alcohol, tobacco, etc., because it basically disincentivizes spending.
Oh.
So, So over time, income tax has mostly been steady as a percent of revenues. So it's about 45% now, so a little higher, but not much. Corporate tax has dropped a ton. So right now it's less than 10% of federal revenues. Payroll tax has expanded significantly. Right now it's about 30 to 40 something percent. And excise taxes have shrunk a ton. So the big differences you're seeing is corporate taxes have dropped a ton. Payroll taxes have grown significantly. So some thoughts.
So, well, here are the two sides of the circle jerk argument, kind of similar to, do we have infinite money or do we have to balance our checkbook? The two sides of the why are corporate taxes so low right now is there's corruption, money in politics. They're never going to lower it because, everyone's in on it and everyone in Congress is making money off of this. And then on the flip side, people will say, oh, they're so low because if you have them raised higher, then you're going to stifle innovation and we'll lose all of our competition to other countries. As in, I've heard that people almost launder money in our country. It's so cheap, but that also brings in a lot of business. So what do you think? Combination of the two? Or is it
I'm sure reality is kind of in between the two. Obviously, if corporate tax rates were 100%, no one would start a business because it's I'm going to make zero money from this. Is corporate tax rates being too high? Is that currently an issue? I'm a bit skeptical. I feel in the 1950s it was much higher, and nobody looks at the 1950s as, a socialist era by any means.
Well, I thought about inventing a genius electronic project the other day, or a product the other day, but then I realized how much I was going to get taxed and decided not to do it.
Yeah, I was going to invent a time machine myself, but, taxes were too high, so not going to happen.
So do you think it's more corruption, and that's just the argument?
I don't know if corruption's even the right word. I just think, as much as people talk about tax the rich, I just don't think that's what drives people to make voting decisions. Because at the end of the day, yes, some politicians get lucrative jobs after they retire, but at the end of the day, I think most politicians, they're trying to get reelected. And I just don't think increasing corporate tax rates is something that motivates people's voting patterns. That's just my honest assessment. I think that's really all it is.
Yeah, I kind of buy that too. I always get mad at people about that when they, you know, complain about us getting involved in wars, and then, you know, no one cares about, international politics that much when it comes to voting, typically.
Well, yeah, that's another area I think
That'd be
foreign.
something interesting to look into is, what do Americans believe versus what affects their voting patterns on election day, and where's the discrepancy between the two?
Elections are an entirely different thing we could talk about in a later episode, because there's a pretty good, right now we have a first past the post system, so you're basically pandering to your primary audience. So, you know, I think this is all very interesting, get to
Mm-hmm.
know all this stuff, but okay, what are we going to do about it? Let's say we're like, you know what, we need to reduce the debt. What do we do? So, like I mentioned earlier, you know, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, DoD, that's a huge percentage of the debt. And yes, you can kind of, pick up pennies for the remaining one third of the budget, but at the end of the day, that's not what's going to move the needle, just being honest. So when it comes to entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, I believe, are funded through the payroll tax. So we can either increase revenues or we can decrease expenditure. So how do you increase revenues? Um, you know, the reality is maybe we're going to have to increase payroll taxes. Not very popular. At a very minimum. So currently, the Social Security tax only goes up to $147,000 of income. So I believe once you get above that, you basically don't pay an additional tax. So it's actually a bit of a regressive tax, because when, let's say, you make $300,000, as a percentage of your income, you're probably paying a lower Social Security tax than somebody who makes under 147. So that's an easy thing. I mean, easy conceptually, not easy to implement in because of the politics, but
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing to look at. And then, that applies to Medicare. Medicaid actually gets their revenue from the normal pile of money. And there's actually a cost share with the state government. So state governments pitch into Medicaid as well. So that's a bit of a different thing. And for people who don't know, so Social Security is basically retirement, federal retirement benefits for all people who are elderly, I guess, past a certain age, post retirement. Medicare is healthcare for people in that bucket. And then Medicaid is healthcare for people who are impoverished, basically. So the US doesn't have as much healthcare coverage as other countries, but it does have some healthcare coverage from a federal level. So Medicare is older people, Medicaid is, impoverished people. So generally speaking, we're probably going to have to increase payroll taxes. The other option is to basically increase the pool of contributors. So basically increase the population of working people. So you could either do immigration, or you could basically, that has to be working immigrants, obviously, which most of them are, or, you know, policies that basically encourage higher birth rates. Problem with that is it's easier said than done. Very few countries, if any, succeed in that. And then the other problem is it takes 20 years to become effective. So if you start increasing birth rates now, you have to wait 20 years until those people start working, right? And then as far as reducing benefits goes, this is where it gets really tough. So you could increase the retirement age. So the president of France did that. I think, was that this year or last year?
I think that was this year, and I remember
Yeah.
a lot of controversy over that on their end.
Yeah. So, or you could reduce the benefits that people get. And that's actually what will happen. So I believe, based off current projections, the Social Security Fund might go bankrupt.
There
Or
was a
it's,
very good debate on this on the what was I Square debates and what is now Open to Debate or something, which is a much less pretentious name. But they did have a debate on that recently, and I was meaning to ask: is this all true that it's only a matter of time before Social Security goes bankrupt unless we either raise the retirement age or.
Short answer is yes, it'll go insolvent. I think in like a decade or two. You're not going to immediately stop getting benefits, though. What will happen is that they'll just scale down the benefits to match, the money coming in. So I don't know the exact number. Let's say it's 70-75% of current benefits. That's what's going to happen.
And I've heard, if I remember right, is the fund that they pull Social Security from like just kind of a group retirement account, as in people put money in it and people make money off of interest. Has the government considered making their money work for them?
So yeah, that's an option.
They could also train a machine learning algorithm to predict the stock market.
So
that's another option.
So the maybe not that second part, but I believe the Social Security Fund mostly invests in treasuries, which right now are returning higher, but traditionally have returned a very low rate of return. And so a lot of other countries, maybe not specifically their Social Security type program, but they'll have a sovereign wealth fund where they invest in all sorts of assets. So Norway has a sovereign wealth fund. A lot of Middle Eastern Gulf states have sovereign wealth funds, and basically they invest more like pension funds or like endowments. So pension funds, and this includes state government pension funds, they'll have money managers who invest their money into bonds, into stocks, into natural resources, into venture capital, into private equity, into hedge funds, a wide variety of instruments. And university endowments do this, philanthropic endowments do this, and like I said, state government pension funds do this. And you will return a higher amount of money than putting your money into treasuries. So maybe that would be a way to kind of make Social Security more on the path to solvency, or avoid the path of insolvency, I guess. The flip side to this, there's two things. One, if Social Security divests from bonds from U.S. treasuries, then that would increase the borrowing costs of U.S. treasuries because there'd be less demand. So would the borrowing costs go up, and would that cause problems separate from Social Security? Who knows? The other side, people say, the U.S. government should not be in a position to actually own, stocks in actual companies. That's sort of a value judgment. I can't really, it's basically an opinion. Should the government do that or not do that? We know for a fact that the state government pension funds already do this. So you have state pension funds doing this. Should the federal government do it? I don't know. That's a judgment call. So, there's no easy answers. Basically, all the policies that would fix this problem are deeply unpopular. We either have to increase taxes, bring in more immigrants, start buying stocks as a federal government, reduce benefits. I mean, are any of these popular? I mean, not really, right?
We could find El Dorado, the lost city of gold.
Yeah. That was going to be the next thing I was going to talk about.
Forgot about that one.
Yeah.
But
yeah. And then another thing I think that comes more specifically with Medicare and Medicaid is, are there ways to reduce costs? And it seems like the big, there's a lot of reasons. Healthcare is an entirely different episode we could do. But a huge thing is drug price negotiations. Historically, the U.S. government has basically not negotiated drug prices with drug companies. And it kind of blows my mind. Like, why would you not negotiate prices? That's like the whole cornerstone of commerce is give and take, And so some people say, other countries get subsidized cheaper versions of drugs and the U.S. government basically subsidizes it all. Who knows? That's something I haven't really researched in depth, but as it stands now, the U.S. government does a pretty bad job of trying to negotiate lower drug prices.
They need to threaten the walkout more.
Who's going to threaten?
if you don't lower the price on Advil, I'm going straight to Tylenol.
Oh yeah, the federal government rep should do that.
Mm-hmm.
Be like, I'm going to go across the street.
Yeah, and I've always wondered if that's one of the reasons why medical costs and also DoD costs are so high, is because on a lot of these products, they are single customers.
Yeah, I think. Well, no, I think single customer would actually give you more leverage. So if you are the only customer, you should have more of an ability to lower prices. That's kind of the traditional
I misspoke.
vendors.
Single producer, single vendor. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. So there's a thing called Porter's Five Forces in business. You know, how many, what is the strength of your vendors, your customers, your competitors, and, you know, two other things I don't remember right now, substitutes and threat of entry, right? And you can apply that in government too. And yeah, if you only have one vendor, things will cost more. But, you know, even in the government, a lot of times there's, you know, the rule is, you know, unless you can, you know, ask for a waiver, basically, you have to do a competition to see, you know, different people bid for a project. So there is still some pricing pressure there. I just don't get, you know, not negotiating drug prices. Like, why not do that? It makes no sense. And then, you know, at the end, the DoD, how do you reduce the budget for the DoD? So the Congressional Budget Office has already run the numbers and said, here are some ways we could reduce the budget. And I mean, it's pretty simple. It's basically reduce the amount of, you know, the amount of personnel, reduce the amount of facilities, the amount of equipment. So basically the CBO has some recommendations, mostly shrink the size of the force, or, you know, are there ways to reduce entitlements? That's also very controversial, obviously.
Is it such a big force because we have so many people teaching our troops woke agenda?
I don't think that's what it is. So, but the flip side to all of what I just said is, you know, defense spending as a percentage of GDP is actually significantly lower now than it was during the Cold War. So, and this link is at the bottom of the DoD section. So,
oh yeah, I saw that. Well, there was the huge drawdown in the 90s, and
yeah,
then
so
it went up. I was actually meaning to look at this now that we have it up, because I know it goes up during the 08 to the other day conflicts, drawdown after we killed Osama. Yep, makes sense.
but
Here
you
we
know,
are.
during Korea, it was around 11% of GDP. At the peak of Vietnam, 8.6, and then, you know, mid 80s, probably 5.7. Dropped
That
down to
puts some perspective.
Yeah, dropped down to 2.7 in 99, bumped all the way up to 4.5% in 2010 during the height of the sort of Iraq Afghanistan era, and then it's dropped back down. So right now it's around a little less than 3.1%. So yeah, I mean, historically speaking, we're actually not spending that much on the DoD compared to what we used to do. Yeah, so I mean, that's basically what we have to do is, you know, increase taxes somehow, or bring in
segue alert. Is it only so small because we're spending so much on having the Ukrainians fight our battles for us?
So I think Ukraine is probably not, you know, in the grand scheme of things, not really moving the needle. I think they're like, I think it's like 40. How much is Ukraine spending this year? I think it's like 40 billion.
40 billion. That feels like a lot. Also, when you get into, and I think this is where people get lost, is when you start talking in the numbers and the billions and trillions, it's a little hard to keep track. in our small paying off my credit card level understanding on paying off debt.
Yeah, so 40 billion, around 40 to 45 billion this year for Ukraine. I think that's
Is that
maybe
a
like
lot?
five.
Too much?
I mean, for
Too little?
comparison, in 2008, Iraq war is probably 140 billion, and then Afghanistan was probably in 2011, FY 2011, it was 97 billion. So those were in two different years, but
Those
for
were
the
wars
sake
that
of
we were fighting.
true, so of course it's higher, but just a point of comparison. And then Ukraine is maybe like 5% of the DoD budget. The DoD budget itself is 14% of the total budget. When you look at it from a top level perspective, it's not really what's moving the needle. And then when you're talking about foreign aid in general, you're talking less than 1% of the budget. And I believe that's specifically about development assistance. So,
Yeah, how much of the aid we're sending to Ukraine is military aid versus like food and
I
paying
think
off
most
their
of what
debt?
we're spending is like actual equipment, like military equipment. Like, I don't think we're not like just dropping giant bags of cash in there, which some people think that's what we're doing. But I think like when we're talking about dollar figures, we're talking about like the dollar figures of the equipment we're sending over.
That'd be a good percentage to put in because that's kind of the hot button topic these days.
Yeah.
I also don't know because I have heard that we are sending some cash, like just cash, not military equipment.
So, okay, are there other ways we can? So it seems like we have to basically reduce spending on things that politicians will not reduce spending on. Plus, we need to
What
increase taxes,
what
which people.
are some tax increases and spending cuts that you think most people would agree on? Cross aisle, solve our problems.
I don't know. I don't know if there's any, to be honest.
Well, yeah, this is why I wouldn't want to be in politics. I don't know how you solve it either.
As far as like, would tax the rich fix the problem? I couldn't find definitive numbers on this. What I read is like it would help, but not really
What
solve the
would
problem.
increasing corporation taxes like just slightly? Like what's the marginal cost per?
I wish I
like,
had the
percent?
numbers. I don't have
That'd
the
be
numbers.
that'd be a cool graph.
But now would be a good time to talk about like, okay, let's think about all the different taxes for wealthy people. So most people who are billionaires, how did they become billionaires?
Usually from having money in the first place is the
Yeah.
starting point.
What is the non sarcastic answer? Like,
Well,
how do you
that's
become a
always
billionaire?
what I feel like is like a lot of. Usually you start
Like,
your own company.
yeah, you
if
start a
you're talking
company.
billionaire level.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of millionaires are like, right. Well, I guess we have to talk in like tens of millionaires plus nowadays. They just kind of have to get born wealthy.
So the theory behind, market value of stocks is the value of it is the money investors put into the company plus the present value of all expected future cash flows. So that's kind of like the finance way of thinking of how much a company is worth, right? So the reason why, Mark Zuckerberg is worth so much money is because we know for a fact Meta is going to bring in billions and billions of dollars year after year. And he, as a shareholder, not the only shareholder, but a shareholder, he's entitled to a certain percentage of that income. So basically, a corporation has revenue coming in, has a wide variety of expenses. Virtually all of those expenses reduce the total taxable income. That includes depreciation, it includes interest payments, operating costs, etc. So after you take all of that away, what's left over is income before taxes, and that's taxed at roughly a 21% tax rate right now. So technically, Mark Zuckerberg is paying 21% at least on his earnings. Now, there's an entirely different question of like, well, companies, find ways to say they're not making any income because of, various supposed
The other circle
expenses.
jerk argument is if you raise taxes, they'll just find a way around it.
I mean, possibly. That's something I haven't really thought enough about, like capital flight. But he is. I think if somebody owns a company and that company is paying 21% tax rate on their income, that person technically is paying taxes. It's just before it leaves the company. Once you get a dividend, you have to pay. I believe dividends are typically treated as income, so they're taxed as income. But what companies can do is, instead of dividends, they can do stock buybacks. So why do companies do stock buybacks? That's exactly what it is. So it's basically a way to return money to shareholders without actually having it, leave the company, except for the shares that you buy, because when the person sells the shares, they pay a capital gains tax on that. But it's a way to basically give money back without paying a tax on it. So there's something else. And then the final thing is, if you sell your stock, you have to pay capital gains tax, which I think ranges from 20 to 25%, something like that. So that's basically the tax that wealthy people pay. So how do wealthy people avoid paying taxes? There's a couple things. So one, they can, do some accounting things to kind of say their company's, not making as much money as it probably is. As long as you're not, technically committing accounting fraud, you can do that. The other thing is, you can tap into your wealth without actually selling your stocks and doing capital gains. So, incurring capital gains taxes. So what a lot of people do is they just borrow money. They basically borrow money at a very low rate from the bank and use their stock as collateral. So they're like, if I don't pay this back, you can take my stock. And they just keep borrowing and borrowing money forever. Whenever their loans come due, they just roll it over into a new loan, and they just do that until they die. Once they die, their heirs receive their stock. The trick here, though, is when an heir receives stock, the cost basis for that stock resets to the price when the heir gets the stock. So let's say you bought a stock for $1, goes up to 100. Okay, there's a huge unrealized gain there. But if you die and you give that stock to your son or daughter, the cost basis for them is $100. So if they immediately sell it to pay off your debts, then they don't have to pay any taxes on that. So that's a loophole that some people want to fix, is the step up cost basis.
I have a coworker who is in favor of a 100% death tax.
I think people would just give all their money to their kids before they die. I think that's what would happen.
I think that's what I told him.
Yeah.
Or give it to some charity.
Yeah. There's a couple other things, like, a luxury tax. Should we increase taxes on, private planes? I actually think this is a clever idea, because what billionaire is going to say, I was going to buy a private jet, but the taxes are too high. The whole point of buying a private jet is to spend a lot of money. So,
Yep.
I don't know if it'll move the needle, but it seems like a clever idea to tax, luxury jets.
There's a lot of private jet salesmen that are getting really nervous right now listening to this.
And this one's more controversial because it applies to a lot of people, the mortgage interest deduction. So everyone who owns a house and has a mortgage, they can, their interest on their mortgage, they can use that to reduce their taxable income. That is a subsidy for homeowners. Is that a good idea? It is a subsidy for a wealthier portion of society.
Yeah, and I imagine people who own rental properties have that subsidy as well, or
Yep.
If they got rid of that subsidy, would that price trickle down to the renters?
That's a good question. I think investors have a certain rate of return they expect. So maybe they'll increase rents. The flip side is maybe home prices would go down.
I'm just trying to find my free lunch here, man.
So anyways, what else? A wealth tax. This is very, very controversial. Technically, there already is a wealth tax. It's called property tax. So, property taxes, which are mostly state run.
I think what most people think of when they say wealth tax is if you're making above a certain amount, you're paying a lot more in taxes.
Well, that already exists. It's income. You're in a higher income tax bucket.
And when people say that, they mean more of that.
So what a wealth tax is a tax on assets instead of income. Property tax already exists. It's a form of wealth tax. Some places like Texas, which have, lower taxes otherwise, actually have very high property taxes. This is the tough thing with a wealth tax is like, how do you measure net worth? It's actually not easy. Income is very easy. If you're working somewhere, your employer has to give you a W-2 that says exactly how much money you make. But wealth is a lot harder to track. Do you have hidden assets somewhere? I imagine it would be a fair amount of overhead to figure out who owns what.
That would be tough. They'd have to be digging up a lot of people's gold in their backyards.
Yeah. And also, if you're illiquid, if you own illiquid assets and you have to pay a tax on them, what if the only way you could do that is to sell off your assets slowly to pay for it? That's something else to think about. Granted, that doesn't really apply with property taxes. Most people can cover that. They just kind of calculate that as part of their expenses, but something else to think about. So, those are some thoughts as far as like tax the rich goes. I mean, wealthy people do pay low. I mean, if you're talking billionaires, they do pay a lower tax rate. That's just a fact. And the reason why is they don't make their money from income. They make their money from owning assets, owning stock, basically. And they do have to pay a corporate tax, but unless they sell their assets, they don't have to pay any other taxes, or if they get dividends. But if the company's not giving out dividends, if it's just doing stock buybacks and you never sell your stock, you just, use it as collateral to take out loans, then the only tax you're paying is the corporate tax. So something to think about. Is there anything else you want to talk about as far as all this goes?
Well, I mean, I didn't know about that with the loan stuff and all that. That's kind of interesting, and that would make sense that people would do that to keep their wealth and also be able to continually borrow money.
I'm going to be honest. Like, if I was in that position, I would do the same thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
that is kind of smart to do it that way.
For people who say like, oh, well, like rich people should like independently choose to pay extra tax for the benefit of all of us. I'm like, well, if you put your money in a 401k, you're already kind of doing the opposite, right? You're already using a tax advantage account to pay less tax. So
how do you close that gap? Is there a way to do that wouldn't screw over someone else?
I mean, you can get rid of step up cost basis. So you could say like, hey, so like once you die, your heirs, the cost that they quote bought your assets at resets to, present value. So let's say you have a bunch of stock that went up a ton and then you die and it goes to your children. If they immediately sell that stock, they pay no tax because the cost basis is how much it cost when you died. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's say you bought a stock for $10, it goes up to $100. If you sold it, you'd have to pay a tax on it. But if you die and your children get it, they quote bought it for $100. It was gifted to them at a price of $100. And then if they sell it, no tax. So
that sounds like a pretty easy thing to go after. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you close this loophole, then, your children would have to pay, the tax as if you sold it, right before you died. And that would go to the government. So something to think about, because as it stands now, you basically can tap into your assets without paying a tax on them. If
I didn't know that was the mechanic behind it, but yeah, that totally makes sense.
And this is something
talk about that enough.
This is something that, you have to be pretty wealthy to pull this off, because this is one of those sort of like special services that banks offer. Like if you're just some random dude and you're like, hey, I have, these stocks in my portfolio. Can I borrow against them? It'd probably be tougher to do that versus like someone who owns like $1 billion in stock.
I think a way of stopping that behavior would be broadly popular.
Yeah, I would say so. So, yeah, I mean, this is the federal budget and the federal debt,
Yeah.
Basically, you have to find ways to increase taxes, unfortunately, and you have to find ways to reduce expenditures on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the DoD. I mean,
That's
it just
it.
is.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
That's a pretty good concluding thought there.
Yeah. Oh, and we're gonna have a segment. So I'm sure we make mistakes during our episodes. So if we made a mistake, email us, and we'll do a segment on future episodes, correcting our mistakes.
I'm sure we'll have plenty.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the Unjerked podcast. So we'll
Thanks
see
for
you guys in a
listening.
few weeks.
Be sure to like, subscribe, yada yada. Share us on social media.
All right.